Hello, and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out in the Robotyne direction, where the Russian forces have managed to advance in three separate directions. First off, in the northeast of Kopani, we've seen the Russian forces are advancing in the direction of the road between Novomykhailivka and Robotyne. So with this, we see that there's an effort by the Russian forces to cut off the main supply line between Novomykhailivka and Robotyne. So the Ukrainians here in the area are holding positions which are mainly focused around Robotyne all the way to the Verbova direction. The Ukrainian forces' main supply line is from Novomykhailivka here from the north, and then there's also likely some from the roads and other areas through the forest lines and fields all across the area here in the Ukrainian salient to the south of Novomykhailivka, which they managed to take in the span of the 6 months long Ukrainian offensive through the summer and the fall seasons of this year. So we see that the Ukrainian forces have been holding onto their positions ever since the end of their offensive, but now the Russian forces started counterattacks in the December month, and now we've seen that they've managed to make some advancements and capture some territories to the south and west of Robotyne, as well as to the northwest and north-southwest of Verbova. The main advances by the Russian forces over the past 24 hours are situated here in the northwest towards the main highway supply line to the Ukrainian forces, and here to the west of Robotyne, where we're seeing that the Russian forces are also trying to attack and gain control over the trenches that are situated to the west of Robotyne. The Ukrainian forces have trenches here to the west of Robotyne and in the northern areas, both in the outskirts of the village as well as to the west of it. All of these areas which the Russians built ahead of the Ukrainian offensive, but with the Ukrainian capture of the area, they then took control over these trenches and are using them now for defensive operations against the Russians. And the Russians are trying to gain control over the northern parts of Robotyne to try and force the Ukrainian forces out of the village and push them away rather than having to storm the village head on and fight through it. The reason for this is if the Russians are able to force the Ukrainians to fall back, then they'll be able to speed this process up, and they'll also be able to avoid more casualties than if they were to storm it directly. This is similar to what we're seeing in the direction of Verbova, where it has been reported that the Ukrainian forces have been withdrawing from the Verbova and ahead of the Russian defensive line that goes through the northwest of Verbova. This line consists of anti-tank ditches and dragon teeth fortifications of concrete, as well as trenches and so on. All of these are situated in the area right here, and trench lines going through the central parts here. The Ukrainian forces had positions here to the west of Verbova, across the anti-tank ditches and the positions in the trenches, and now we are seeing them withdraw from these positions as the Russian forces first started attacking the northern flank and have since then also started attacking the southern flank, where they now have reached and passed through the anti-tank ditches and are now trying to flank the Ukrainian positions and cut them off. And preventing that cut off, the Ukrainian forces decided to withdraw from the direction of Verbova ahead of the anti-tank ditches beyond to the positions they had prior to their offensive. So we are seeing the Ukrainian forces being pushed out of the area here, the salient that they are holding, which would negate the Ukrainian gains through the offensive that they did in the past 6 months. We then move on in the northern direction towards Novomykhailivka, where the Russian forces have yet again attempted to get a foothold within Novomykhailivka. Continuous operations start and continue in the direction of Novomykhailivka as the Russian forces try to gain control and get a foothold of the city. We see also efforts by the Russian forces to push in the northern directions, but there's been no territorial changes reported. We then move north in the direction of Marinka, where the Russian forces have gained more success here, where they've managed to gain a foothold within Robotyne in the central parts of the city. So we're seeing continuous Russian advances in the direction of the west of Marinka. After the full capture of the city, the Russian forces are now continuing into the city of Robotyne, where they pressure the Ukrainian positions in the area. We also see that the Russian forces are looking to expand their zone of control west of Donetsk city, where we're seeing that they have been fighting in Marinka for a long time, but we've also seen some positional fighting here to the southeast of Krasnoarivka, where the Russian forces managed to gain control over the industrial zone and fortified area here to the south of the city, where they've managed to gain area control over this area here, which was confirmed with video evidence. You also see trenches going through the area from the satellite images, which shows that this area was actually fortified. We've also seen the Russian forces gain control over the area right here. This square right here, rectangle, is an area the Russians captured after the start of the invasion. We see the trenches here in the east where the front line stopped for the Russian forces, and then we have the trenches here where the front line started for the Ukrainian forces. And we have seen that the Russians have managed to gain control over this area right here. Looking closer at the satellite images we have available, we see that there are trenches the Ukrainians hold here into the north of the Russian positions that they captured. We also see that there are some to the west of it, as well as further up, we see further trenches down south. So we see that there's trenches everywhere along this road to the south of Krasnoyarivka. As for the forest line here to the east, we see that these trenches actually continue all the way through the forest lines, all the way up north. We also see that it extends westwards. So we see that there are these trenches to go to the western direction, connecting all the way through to the next forest line. We go further north, we see further trenches and trench connections between these positions. Some are newer than others, and they just continue all the way up to huge trench networks to the east of the city. And we also see here to the east that there are trenches on the Russian side as well. So there's been some trench warfare ongoing in the direction of Krasnoyarivka since the start of the invasion and in the Donbass war prior to the invasion. And the Russians taking control over some of these positions actually allowed them to, rather than fight the trenches head on, where we see that the Russians have trenches here to the east and the Ukrainians have trenches to the west, they're going around and attacking from the south, which would give them the advantage of facing the trench in a stellar line. This, however, only works until the Russian forces reach this area right here, where they'll be facing off against trenches in a very intricate line that goes through all of these areas. It's a very intricate trench network and system here to the east of Krasnoyarivka, which likely, beyond the date of the capture of these satellite images, have been significantly extended. We likely have Ukrainian trenches all throughout the southern parts, as well as in the forest lines here to the east, all connected like a cobweb. All of this in preparation for Russian assaults. Therefore, we likely see that the Russians will try to go around Krasnoyarivka rather than storming it, similar to Avdiivka, where we've seen that the Russians go to the north and to the south of the city, trying to capture the flanks rather than taking control over the city. This would limit the supplies of the Ukrainians. So we're seeing in the direction of Avdiivka there's been further advances by the Russians in 3 directions, and the Ukrainians counterattacked in the direction of Stepove, where they managed to regain some territory here. So we're seeing first off to the south of the water treatment plants, the Russians gained further control of the areas, reaching the forest lines. In the Stepove direction, we've seen that the Ukrainians recaptured some parts of the forest lines in an attempt to cut off the Russian positions here in Stepove. So we're seeing a lot of fighting in this direction as well. In the northern parts, the Russians reached the outskirts of the Dacha area here to the east of Novomykhailivka. As for the south of Novomykhailivka, the Russians gained control over some of the forest lines, which shows further Russian operations to the northwest of Krasnoyarivka, expanding their northern flank, as it is pretty much a salient in and of itself. If we could switch the camera around, you would see that the Ukrainians actually could launch attacks to the north and to the south of this flank to cut off the Russian positions in Krasnoyarivka. However, it is likely that the Russians are trying to expand their zone of control in the salient and capture some of these villages on the sides to prevent any Ukrainian attempts at launching counterattacks. Also, the supply situation in Avdiivka seems to be pretty dire, considering that the Russians have pretty much both of the flanks under heavy control due to how the fighting is taking place in the area, and especially with the railways being under Russian control here to the north of Avdiivka. As for the Marinka direction, I mentioned in my previous video that there's a big risk of the Ukrainians launching a counterattack to the south of Marinka, with the areas being complete open fields. So the Russians need to gain control over Pobieda if they want to secure the flank of Marinka. And it was reported earlier today that the Ukrainians actually did launch an attack towards Marinka and the southern flank, where we see some of this geolocated footage where a Russian FPV drone hunted some of the Ukrainian armored vehicles that were launching their attacks to the south of Marinka. So we see that a fight took place to the south as the Ukrainians launched an armored assault towards Marinka, including a few infantry fighting vehicles, armored personnel carriers, and tanks. However, the attack did not succeed, but this shows the urgency of the Russians needing to send forces to the south to capture Pobeda to secure the flank, as the Ukrainians have control over this highway between Kurahovo and all the way down to Marinka and Pobeda. So the Russians need to gain control over Horivka, Pobeda, and far areas here in the highway to protect the flanks of Marinka and secure their positions prior to attack Krasnohorivka, which shows that they'll likely try to gain control over the river line here to the north to secure some positions. Horivka, gain control over the areas here to the south to cut off the highway, and gain control over Pobeda, which would significantly expand their zone of control in the area, solidify the southern flank towards Krasnohorivka, and potentially start operations in that direction. We then move north to the south of Bakhmut in the direction of Orlivka, where we have this footage which shows Russian FPV drones hunting Ukrainian positions here in a quarry to the west of Pivdene, which shows that the efforts from fighting here in the quarry areas and hills west of Orlivka has ended, and it has now turned to the Russians going back to their positional fighting and attempting to hurt the Ukrainian positions across the front line, away from the heavily fortified areas and beyond to the positions where the Ukrainians are gathering troops, equipment, supplies, and so on. Moving further north in the direction of Bakhmut, we have seen some small territorial changes as the Russians stormed the forest lines and forest patches here to the south of the cemetery area after they regained control of it. So with this, we see continuous efforts by Russian forces to advance in the direction of Jesov Yar straight ahead, expand their zone of control on the northern flank, pressuring the Avdiivka direction from the northeast and northeast. We see that the Russians continue their pressure in the northern flank with little advances here at the end of the year. The weather isn't exactly optimal for any offensive operations, which is why we have seen many of these operations slow down despite it continuously advancing, which shows that they still have a lot of effort to put in, but they are hindered by the Ukrainian defenders defending and counterattacking, and also the weather being terrible generally for these kinds of operations. Finally, we move north to the direction of the northwest of Kremenna, where here to the west of Novomykhailivka, a tank battle between Ukrainian and Russian tanks took place, where we see this geolocated footage here, showing the results of one of such battles which took place here at West Novomykhailivka. So with this, we see that the Ukrainians are trying to pressure the Russian advances towards Terny by advancing in the direction of Novomykhailivka, threatening the Ukrainian positions in the Terny direction, has put the Ukrainians on the idea that if they threaten Novomykhailivka to the northeast, then the Russians would be forced to redirect some of their forces, which would limit the effects of their own offensive in the direction of Terny and potentially lead to the Ukrainians launching their counterattacks in that direction and negate some of the advances that the Russian forces had made. And with that, we end off this update. Thank you for watching and have a great day.